Hello and welcome to episode number 60 of Behind the Impact. I'm your host, Jeremy Brown. In this episode, Leela Stake, the Senior Partner and Global Managing Director of Responsible Business at FleishmanHillard, joins the show. Leela, welcome to Behind the Impact.
Hi, Jeremy. Great to be with you.
Thank you for joining me. Really excited for this conversation and to dig into your background and all the incredible work that you're doing now with clients. So, before we get into Fleischman Hillard and the work that you're doing now, what I would like to start off with first is going back in time to where it all began for you in terms of your career. Can you give me that journey?
Ooh, I love an origin story. Well, I'll probably go back even prior to my career. I always tell my kids that in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you came from. So that's always been a really big deal for me. And I think what really and originally brought me to the impact space was my family background. My parents were from opposite ends of the earth. So my mom was an immigrant from India. I don't know if you're an Olivia Dean fan, but I was at her show at the Chase Center here in San Francisco last weekend, and she has a song called Carmen about her grandmother, who had immigrated, I think, to the UK from Guyana, and just it's about the story and about what a leap of faith that is, but just the pride and love that she has for her grandmother, and what a big deal that was. So my mom made that move. Many of my relatives on the Indian side had come to the States and then gone back after they had studied here, but my mom ended up staying and meeting my dad. But on the Indian side of my family, I was super close to my maternal grandmother, also known as my nani. So I would spend a lot of time visiting her in India growing up. Her parents had marched alongside Gandhi in the Indian independence movement, was very, very interested in civil rights. And she actually had an amazing story. She had lost her husband, so my grandfather, in a car accident tragically, and was left with three children under the age of 10. And it was a very, in those days, for a woman to kind of go out on her own was very unusual. But she went on to become one of the first women city council members for the city of Mumbai. And it was so interesting because in preparation for this conversation, Jeremy, I looked it up last night because you always hear the family lore. And I was just like, I'm going to look this up to make sure I'm not speaking out of turn. But I looked her up and it said Liliben Pandya is a celebrated firebrand former corporator, which is like a city council person who left a lasting legacy. She made history by serving as the first woman chairperson of the BMC, in the powerful standing committee, a role rarely held by women in local politics. So she was one of my favorite people growing up. We would go there for the summers. I would spend time with her. And again, just like feeling like you're standing on the shoulders of giants, even though she wouldn't have described herself that way. So that was one side of my family. On the other side, my father was from a small town in Kansas, and he was a Unitarian Universalist minister. And a huge part of that faith is really thinking about service as an expression of faith. And that's how I was raised, right? Church every Sunday, but also thinking about being out in the community as a way that you embody and embrace your faith, and really having respect for the interdependent existence of the web of life that we exist in. So I'll go into my professional journey, but I always love to start with just like, how did I get there in the first place, which really was about my family background. So that was my childhood, but then I ended up making my way to Stanford. And prior to that, I had done a lot of community service work. So I was president of the community service club starting in middle school, went on to do that in high school. And that was a huge part of what was really important to me growing up. And then I got to Stanford, and obviously there are a lot of different things to potentially study, but I ended up taking a couple of really formative classes early on in my journey. Was with a professor named Rob Reich, not to be confused with Robert Reich, although they have the same spelling of their names. But he was a very young professor, a political scientist, but very interested in the social impact space. And then the late Gregory Dees, who is really considered one of the founders of the social entrepreneurship space. Um, uh, he taught a class that I took sophomore year on business skills for the social sector. And it was the first time I realized this wasn't just an avocation, but a vocation, and that there was a field of inquiry and study dedicated to this space. It's not that people hadn't been doing amazing work in this space for many generations before that, but in terms of it actually being considered a true field of study, that was the first time. So that was how I kind of got into the space in the first place.
Wow. Going back to your grandmother, it sounds like she was very much an influence on you growing up, but also I'm wondering if you take yourself back to those times where you're traveling to India and visiting with her, were there any lessons that you took from those experiences that directly apply to you today?
Oh yeah, so many. I think it just broadened my aperture on the world. It's so amazing to have these two like truly different parts of my background because and I've always thought of it like in some ways the best version of it is that you can fit in anywhere. So I can travel lots of places in the world and people think that I maybe could be from there. The negative side of it can also be you don't like fully fit anywhere, right? Like I was only half Indian, and so you kind of fit, but you kind of don't. I studied Indian classical dance, but I didn't speak the language. And so there's sort of pros and cons to all of that, but mostly I would say it was a pro, and I just feel so fortunate that I got to have the experience of traveling internationally at a young age and really getting to experience cultures that were very different than mine. And that did actually lead me after I graduated college. I had an amazing fellowship to work in philanthropy. And I was able to work in 6 countries in South and Southeast Asia, including India. But I guess what I would say about that is even if you end up doing a mostly desk job later, getting out and actually like doing work in communities is extremely important. And so, I was really inspired by the work that she did. It was a case where every day when I was there, people would be coming in to ask her for guidance, for advice. She was super active in the community. I spent time in high school working at a hospital for children with disabilities that she had been involved with for many years, and I wouldn't have had that connection without her. And I think that direct service experience, even though direct service isn't my pathway of service right now necessarily in my day-to-day work, being able to start in that way is incredibly important because you get a firsthand look at the issues and the people who are impacted, and that's incredibly informative.
You mentioned that you worked in philanthropy out of college. Take me back to that time. What did that look like?
Yes. So I had a fellowship called the Ford Fellowship from Stanford, and it's an amazing experience because essentially the university helps you find a mentor in the field and helps to support your salary. And so it just was a way to, I'd say, have an amazing running start early in my career. And I hadn't, even though I had this amazing global background, a lot of my studies had been more locally focused in the US. And so I think I was feeling hungry at that age. I probably had some wanderlust, and I said, I'll go anywhere you want me to go for like however long, basically. And I got the opportunity to work at the Asia Foundation, and I ended up in 6 countries in South and Southeast Asia. So I was in Indonesia and Cambodia, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, and just had some really incredible opportunities while I was there to learn all kinds of things that I'm sure I wouldn't have learned otherwise. So in India, I was reviewing environmental programs there, and I was in extremely rural areas and in several cases, and was very moved by the work that was happening on the ground. And then in Nepal, just to give another example, I was during the Maoist state of emergency, and I was helping to develop a strategic plan there. So just an incredibly interesting time to be on the ground doing work with some really amazing people.
And now, if we fast forward to present day, you're at FleishmanHillard, and you spent over 2 decades, or have been in the world of responsible business for over 2 decades. Walk me through your career journey getting to FleishmanHillard. How did all that come about?
Sure. Well, I ended up back in the States because my partner now who I've been married to this year in October for 20 years. So amazing, was starting law school at the time. And I had always said I would never move for a boy, but I did in this case, and I'm glad I did because it's been 2 decades and we're still together. So, um, but that just was a little bit of a fork in the road because I had been doing this global development work, and either I felt like I was going to be traveling all the time to be going back and forth to the field, or I felt like I was going to be kind of very disconnected from the work after having the very like intimate and engaging experiences that I'd had for the years before that. And so this field of responsible business was burgeoning at that time. And I literally did a Google search for corporate responsibility consulting in Washington, D.C., which is where we were living. And I found APCO Worldwide, which I worked at for 10 years after that. And it was like the first thing that popped up. They happened to be interviewing. I landed there. And I think it was just a really interesting time in that field because a lot of people were being put in these roles at their companies, and it was either a swan song before retirement or they didn't necessarily know very much about the social impact space. So it's like they were trying to do social impact work, but that wasn't actually something they had studied or had necessarily even professionally done before, which is a problem because it's useful to have knowledge and experience of the field before you do it. And so there was a real need to have consultants who could help be strong partners in the work. So it was a really good time to join and shape the field. And I think because it was a somewhat nascent field, it was a place where at a relatively young age in my 20s, I felt like I could have a lot of influence and impact. And I think one of the great things about consulting is you can have a lot of different jobs within one. And a lot of what I've loved about the consulting work that I've done is that rather than it being kind of your typical management consulting endeavor where you come in, you do a sprint for a couple of months, and then you leave. A lot of my clients I have had for many, many years, and you've come to feel like a kind of a strategic and important extension of their team, but it's something where you can help really build things over time. So yeah, I've now been at Fleischman for 10 years, and it's been a great journey. And the field has, in some ways, changed a lot, and in some ways hasn't.
The term responsible business. It's it's pretty clear what the responsibilities are for somebody who has this type of job title. But obviously, you and I, before we had this conversation, we talked about the nomenclature within the overall corporate impact field. Can you define responsible business just so the listeners can be on the same page in terms of the naming?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think it's businesses that are taking a longer term view to things that are going to drive the business forward, but are also going to be mindful of the different stakeholders that are important to them. So the impact that they're having on people, whether that's employees or the communities in which they live and work, and also things like their environmental impact, which is important not just to be like good stewards of the planet, but because that can have a lot of implications for like costs and running a business effectively over time. So yes, I think your impact on the community, the impact on employees and that you have, and the impact that you have just overall on being kind of an ethical business, and trying to figure out. I wouldn't say that it looks exactly the same for every company. So I think a really important foundational step for organizations that are growing a responsible business offering is to think about what are the things that are truly aligned to your business, and in those areas figuring out how you can have a positive impact. And that also goes back to business values, which differ depending on what your business are. But I think but thinking about how your business defines those values and then sticks to them over time. So that's what I think founders and executives have to figure out for their businesses.
What's unique about your role is that you have a front row seat at all these different companies and how they're approaching, whether we call it responsible business or corporate impact or social impact. What are some of the patterns you've seen from clients that you've worked with over the years?
Yes. Well, over the years, I sort of chuckle because nomenclature, as you mentioned, Jeremy, has gone on kind of a long and winding journey. So it was kind of corporate responsibility when I was getting into this space. And then, we've heard all kinds of things: ESG, shared value, impact in different types of shapes and forms. And, I don't think there's just one term that people are using today, but sometimes I sort of chuckle that it's taken 20 years, but we kind of flipped corporate to business and just changed the order of the words around to get to responsible business. But I think what hasn't changed for some practitioners like me is philosophically like what we're trying to do. We are trying to find the win-wins that look at a long-term view of what how business success can be paired with, trying to create a better environment for people and the planet. So I don't I that in that sense things haven't evolved that much, but I think the nomenclature has changed. And I'm very delighted actually that a lot of the wonky acronyms are going away because I think it's made it hard to describe the work to people, and it's been harder for people to understand what the work is. So I think trying something, why we have landed on responsible business as a framing, is that it should be obvious the body of work we're talking about versus having to like unpack an acronym that people may or may not really get.
One initiative that I want to dive more into is FH for Inclusion. Can you walk me through that initiative?
Yeah, so around our 70th anniversary, we decided rather than just throwing fancy parties at FleishmanHillard, we would do something more action oriented and try to unite all of our offices around the world to serve in local communities and to find nonprofit organizations to partner with on pro bono or volunteer work. So, yeah, it's been a great endeavor. We've now volunteered over 48,000 hours since the initiative was launched and supported more than 160 different organizations around the world. So it was very big around the anniversary celebration, but the great thing is that it's kind of continued on since then. And it's been really important to me because obviously a lot of my day to day is spent advising clients on this work, but you do have to embrace the work yourself too. And so it's been really wonderful to have this platform to do that work within the organization too.
And roughly how many offices for Fleischman Hillard?
Thanks for that question, Jeremy. So we have over 80 offices around the world, but also it's one of the really important things is we're part of Omnicom, which is now the largest communications agency of its kind worldwide. And so we have a lot of different affiliates, even in places where we don't have a Fleischman Hillard office.
So 80 offices around the world. How do you manage that in terms of getting all the employees involved in volunteering? How do you manage all that?
Yeah, I think when that initiative was created, it was, really in conjunction with local leadership and making sure people had, toolkits and playbooks. And that's part of what we use with the clients that we work with too, right? So you have to create something where there's enough consistency across every office. So there's kind of a go-to playbook, but also leaving enough flexibility because not all offices are the same size. Not everyone is going to be able to do as robust a partnership. So, leaving enough flexibility, which is actually a kind of a guiding practice for a lot of the work I do, leaving enough flexibility for local regions to, put their own mark on things, I think is really important in initiatives like this.
And then getting back to the clients that you work with, one of the topics that I've been having quite a bit in terms of conversations with practitioners is this idea of driving business value through impact. So, in other words, less program management and more about how do we connect our efforts to business outcomes to create a more durable function. I'm curious, in the conversations with your clients, how often is that coming up in terms of connecting impact to business?
Universally. Like That's an easy that's an easy question and answer. I cannot think of a single instance where that's not coming up. And it doesn't mean that it wasn't coming up before, but it is. I think everything is being scrutinized with that lens now, much more than I've seen at any other point in my career in this space.
Has there been any client that's figured it out, like how to actually do that, do it efficiently to become a more valuable part of the business? And if so, what have they done?
Yeah, I mean, some of it starts with, I mean, I think a lot, in many cases, leadership starts from the top in this area and having leadership that's bought into this being an important priority. So I think one of the best practices is obviously leaders in this space that are very, very connected to the C suite and are actively in conversation with them, setting those priorities together, having accountability as really like senior level executives in this area. And I think that that is a huge defining um, criteria for success in this space. I'd say another thing, and obviously I'm a little biased because I work within a communications agency, but you could have the best programs in the world, and if no one knows about them and you're not communicating about them effectively and engaging people, you're really not getting the full value out of them. So, I mean, it's certainly, conversely, it's also true you can't communicate about something that isn't worth communicating about. So, you do need to get the bones and the strategy right. There's no question about that. And I think there's a lot of scrutiny right now around greenwashing or whatever other terms you might want to use in terms of things feeling performative and people having holding organizations accountable for that. And that's good. But I think there's a lot of conversation around that. And there probably needs to be more conversation around the fact that there needs to be more effective communication around the efforts that you do have. And that is going to, I think, help create, the long-term value that we're talking about.
There seems to be a gap that I've noticed lately, and it connects back to communications. One of the things that it's a core belief of mine is that executives don't truly understand the value of impact work. They might understand volunteering and things like that, but they don't understand how that actually adds value to the business. And one of the gaps that I'm seeing is practitioners not having the skill set to communicate their work effectively in a way that somebody at the C-suite level will understand. So not being able to put impact into their terms. When it comes to internal communications, do you have any advice for practitioners to essentially strengthen that muscle?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is practice, and I think that goes for internal communications as well as external communication. So, one of the things that has been really seminal in terms of our own thought leadership in the past year has been something called License to Lead. And it's talking about in an environment in which it feels like the only constant is change, what do you do with that? And I think what I have seen, um, especially in the past couple years, is that there has been a tendency to move from leadership to laggard and to get hamstrung into inaction because there has been so much change in the landscape and people don't really know what to do, and so they're not doing anything. They're not really communicating anything. Um, and this research was done with sort of engaged consumers. So not just internal audiences, but I think that there are a lot of similar takeaways for what you're talking about, even in terms of what internal audiences might be looking for. So in this case, an engaged consumer would be people that have made like up to three or more purchasing decisions in a year based on what a company's reputation was. So they decided to buy something different, or they decided to buy something because they felt a certain way about that company, or they decided to be active in social media around that. But the question around it was like, what do engaged consumers really expect of organizations? And what we found is it's not that it's not okay for companies to change. Like, I think that people sort of are understanding that there's a significant amount of change happening right now. But actually, the lesson was you have to communicate about it, you have to take some accountability, and you have to have consistency across how leaders are talking about the changes that you're making. And I think, as getting back to your original question about internal audiences, that's important too. I don't think the expectation is we're not making any changes. The expectation is don't leave me in the dark, don't give me competing messages, bring me along the journey with you. And I think that's an important lesson for companies to take right now, and impact leaders as well, which is to be somewhat open to some amount of change, but thinking about how do you tell that story and bring people along the journey with you.
If you were sitting in the shoes of a head of social impact and you have this new program idea that you want to roll out and you have to communicate it to obviously the C-suite to get buy-in, where would you start in terms of framing the program in a way that would get the C-suite to lean in a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think it all gets back to that question of business alignment. And when you ask the question, it's like everyone's trying to make the case for more business alignment right now. But I think I am seeing some of the most exciting work right now, I think, is in the area of signature programs. So companies, rather than sort of saying, okay, we're going to give to a whole bunch of different organizations, but it's not like really laddering up to some that's greater than the parts. Thinking about what is a signature program that they could create that is truly business aligned. So it might be like a workforce development initiative where, in one case, I'm working with an amazing health tech company, and they, as they look ahead to the next 10 years, there's a skilled workforce shortage. That is a business problem that the business is going to face, right? But they have created an impact oriented initiative to help build the pipeline for talent in that field and open people's eyes to the amazing work that is health tech, that not everybody knows about. And obviously, that has incredible benefits long term for the industry, which is facing the workforce shortage. It also has incredible benefits to lots of young people around the world who are trying to figure out what the heck they're going to do, because a lot of the careers of the future are things that are very different than what we were studying or what we thought we were going after or our parents were. Um, and so with so much change happening, that's a great example of where you could get to a win-win. I think that is absolutely getting business leaders attention because it's solving a business problem and it's solving a social issue.
Is there anything that a practitioner should avoid when it comes to that framing or that narrative?
Well, I think you just have to figure out how to have your story be super sharp and be able to talk about it in business terms. So I don't think it can be exclusively business terms. So a mistake, you could over rotate and talk about it too much in business terms and not get the emotional aspect that is, I think, really critical to this work. But you can't do the opposite either. You can't have just the feel good side of it and not have the business story. So whether that's, obviously there are a growing number of practitioners in the space who have, gotten business credentials and use those very well. I don't think it's the only way, but I think that's it's really important to be able to pair both sides of your message with in that way.
That's also a muscle that I feel needs to be strengthened a bit more in terms of the business acumen. Many practitioners that come into this world of corporate impact, they come from the nonprofit sector, and so they're not privy to how corporations typically operate and the nomenclature, going back to that word nomenclature, in the business world. But it is a muscle that needs to be strengthened, to your point, because you need to have that balance between the feel good stories and also the business side, to create something that's going to resonate with somebody at the C-suite level.
100%. And especially now. That was true. That's been true to some extent my whole career, but you cannot survive without it today.
And when you look at the clients that you've worked with over the years, are there any particular areas where they get stuck when it comes to the whole business value side of things? Is there anywhere they get stuck?
Well, I think inertia is a real thing. And I think sometimes, organizations can hold on to legacy relationships just because they've had them for a long time, even if they haven't really demonstrated business value. And I think part of that is the field has really changed. So if you look back, I mean, there have been degrees of corporate philanthropy happening for many decades. Sometimes that was called like bosses' wives philanthropy, or like if you go way back to just like pet causes of particular executives or that sort of thing. And it actually, I would say, for probably a number of years was considered sort of um, inappropriate to give to things that were aligned to the business. So it's a big change then to now say everything has to be business aligned. I mean, we're going way back, probably like way before like my career even started in many cases. But I think the unwinding of some legacy relationships where someone just happens to know somebody or they've been giving to an organization for a long time or been involved for a long time, but they actually can't answer the question of how it's really aligned to this particular business or driving business forward. That's a problem. And it doesn't mean you necessarily pull the plug immediately, but you have to figure out how to unwind some of those relationships. And to figure out an effective sunset strategy so more of your resources can be used in more strategic ways.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. And when you start off the conversation, you mentioned that you went to Stanford and you're very much still involved in the Stanford ecosystem. And you're on the board of the Haas Center for Public Service. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it was my home away from home in college. I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I went to college, and I felt so happy and fortunate to be there. And I also felt a little bit overwhelmed. My first day of class, just to double down on that a little bit more and double click, I guess. But I went into my very first class freshman year, and Secret Service was there because Chelsea Clinton was also in my class, and so it was a lot. It was a lot at first to adjust to that environment, even though I was delighted to be there. But I found the Haas Center for Public Service. I stumbled upon it very early in my experience and was very happy because the whole philosophy of that place is to bridge theory and practice and to make sure that you're putting all of the great learning that you have to work, like actually going out and doing things in the community. So I was part of an amazing community organizing initiative called One East Palo Alto and learned a lot through that. And I started doing that freshman year and ended up staying involved with the Haas Center for all of my 4 years and then for all of the years that have come since then. But it's some of the very best people I've ever met and some of the really best experiences I've ever had.
And in terms of the students there and the future social impact leaders of the world, what advice do you typically give students who are looking at whether they want to go to the nonprofit sector or they're considering the corporate sector and trying to break into CSR or responsible business? What advice do you give those students?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's like two framings that the Haas Center uses that I think everyone should use in a way. One is pathways of service. So it's really thinking about there's not just one pathway of service. Direct service is certainly one amazing pathway to service, but there are many others. Like government service is one we need a lot more young people pursuing and going into. Like government service and policy making is a huge one. Social entrepreneurship, philanthropy, um, I think part of that is getting at this notion that in some ways you could take many different career paths and still have an incredibly positive impact. There's not just one shape or form that takes, so that a place like the Haas Center or framing like Cardinal Service and trying to make service an integral part of every student's experience, the vision is that kind of no matter what you end up doing, you can have a positive impact in what you do. So that's the pathways of service. And then there's also the principles of service, which I would say is equally important. So, um, to your question of what I would tell young people, I would say one of the biggest things is it's not just what you do, but how you do it. That's what the principles of service are all about. So things like having humility, having reciprocity, being prepared to go be of service in your work, taking time to reflect about the service that you've done. That's the rigor that the Haas Center and Cardinal Service tries to bring to students to say it's not enough to just have good intent. Um, you have to go deeper than that to actually make sure you are having a positive impact in the work that you do.
And for students who might be graduating, if you can teach them one lesson about the impact field before they get into it, whatever pathway they take, what would that lesson be?
I would say consider the entirety of your life in terms of the ways that you will be of service. So it is obviously important the professional route or routes you take. First of all, life, hopefully, if we're so lucky, is very long. So you could have many different points in your career. And so think holistically about that. It's very interesting now having friends that may have gone one career path, but now they're going back to being teachers in their 40s, or they're thinking of other ways that they might be even more service oriented in the next chapters of their life. That's amazing. That's the professional part. But I think one of the things I've learned and has been really fulfilling for me is thinking not just about my profession, but like, what am I doing outside of my job too that's filling my cup, whether that's advisory councils or boards. And I would say it's never too early to start. So one of the amazing thing about the Haas Center board that I've been chairing is that we have student members of the board, and we are like, we're an integrated board. So I'd say there's many different opportunities. If you are a student or in your 20s or 30s, like, don't feel like you have to be like all the way like advanced in your career to get involved in those kinds of ways, because like you could have a professional profession that's very fulfilling to you. That has been true for me, and still, no matter what profession you're in, it's not going to scratch every itch that you have. So you have to, like, if you're not going to work on every issue area you're passionate about, or you might, for me, I hadn't done as much government work as I wanted to. And so I got really involved in one of my local town committees, and that's been really fulfilling to me. Or, think about what you can do to support the next generation in your own life. And maybe that's, if you choose to have kids, that can be coaching your own kids soccer teams. I've done that. But thinking about just all of the different ways you can have a positive impact, not only within the professional journey that you have, but all of the ways that you spend your time and life outside of that.
Okay, let's end with this. What's something that you know now about the impact field that you wish you would have known earlier in your career?
I mean, I think one of it is I have become an eternal optimist. That is really hard sometimes, but I would say, especially now, continue to innovate and yeah, try to hang on to an eternal optimism about what's possible. I think that's the amazing thing. That's why I love being regularly connected to sort of that university phase of life, because you feel like so many things are possible. And I think that that's a really important guiding principle to hang on to, and especially now. So one of the things I don't like that I'm hearing some is just people talking about they're waiting for the pendulum to swing back. Is like, I don't know if you've heard that expression, but I'm hearing that a lot. And to me, that framing is not very energizing, because it just feels like we're like waiting for something to go back to the way that it was, versus thinking about what we might be able to create differently in the future. To me, that's much more energizing. And I guess I would say, especially for young people, think about the role they can play in making that possible, especially now. Like, again, this field is relatively new. growing. And so those of us that have been in this space for a long time have as much to learn from the people that are coming out of um, higher education and those kinds of experiences in that phase of life now as they do from us. I truly believe that that is true. And so people should feel, I think, empowered even at a young age to be leaders.
Leela, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation, walking me through your career journey and the work that you're doing at Fleshman Hillard. And please hang on to that optimism because we need more of that in the world.
I hope so. It's not all sunshine and roses, but a lot of it can be. Thanks, Jeremy.
This episode is brought to you by Social Impact World, the intelligence layer for corporate impact. To learn more, go to socialimpactworld.com. I'm Jeremy Brown. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Behind the Impact.